Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Hiby R3 Pro Saber 2022 edition. This is an entry-level dedicated digital audio player, an MP3 player for the layman. That is kind of the last of a dying breed, and while it might not be perfect, we'll talk about it, this frankly might still be your best available option. You see, in this market, in this budget audio player market, smartphones are basically taking it over the low end, right? And in the high end, well, Android's effectively taking over that. So these compact, inexpensive players like this are disappearing. You used to have Fiio, right? They have formerly exited this market. Walkman, all Walkmans have become Android-based players. There's used to be Cow on plenty of stuff. I don't know if those are even available in the US anymore. Even Apple iPod dropped out of the market. So it really is just Shanling and Hiby. They're still kind of carrying the torch for this general market segment. So if you're like me and you like digital audio players, I really love to have these things. There's just not a lot of budget options left. The R3 Pro Saber that I have here, this one's coming in at 210 bucks. And while maybe that's not the most budget, it's still about half the cost of your entry-level Android-based players. And frankly, it's got a bunch of pretty cool functionality. I mean, it's basically an MP3 player. It's does double duty as a USB dongle. It's also a Bluetooth receiver. So frankly, on paper, it's kind of got a lot of value. And for the past few weeks, I've been living with this R3 Pro Saber to find out, does it deliver? And that's what we're going to talk about in this review. Like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're here now live, how's it going? Sorry, I just touched the camera. Hopefully we didn't make you seasick there. But if you have any questions about the R3 Pro Saber that I forget to get to in this review, stick around for the Q&A and you can ask me whatever questions you want. Leave it in the live chat and I'll get to it. Otherwise, let's see, a quick shout out to Hiby for sending this in for review. I do have a link to them in the description if you want to check out the R3 Pro Saber. But for now, let's go back to the table and start talking about what I like about this stuff and, you know, maybe what are some of my quibbles, right? What we're going to do is we'll start by talking about the physical stuff. We'll cover what comes inside the box, the build quality, all that jazz. And then we'll get into the functionality. And yes, I will talk about what this thing sounds like. Although if you're waiting for commentary on like how well the sound stage is reproduced, I'm not that guy. But anyway, we will talk about what this thing sounds like and all the other good stuff. So yeah, let's just start off with the packaging. Here you go. This is what the R3 Pro Saber 2022 edition comes in. Fairly simple box, and what you get with it is frankly pretty simple and bare bones, but I don't know, I suppose it's appreciated. You get your standard USB-A to USB-C cable, which you could use for charging or use for ostensibly putting music on the device. It does have a micro SD card slot on it, so that was how I did all my music transfer. You can see I didn't take this cable out, but it is nice that they include it. They also do include a couple of different screen protectors. In fact, I think there were 3 or 4 of them. Like the device had screen protectors pre-installed on it. I took them off because I don't really need them, but it does also come with a spare plastic screen protector. I'll put that one to the side, as well as a spare tempered glass screen protector. So plenty of options. I'm not sure why there's so many screen protectors, but there are indeed plenty of options. And then on top of the screen protectors, they also include this little snap-on carry case, which I'm actually going to go ahead and snap onto it for now, just to demonstrate it, but also to kind of talk about its, in my opinion, necessity. So it is a nice svelte, bare bones, snap-on hard plastic carry case that thankfully does not cover up the buttons, so you have pure access to the buttons, although it does give them a little bit of a cover that prevents, I think, accidental button presses. So I actually liked it. The reason that I actually think that this case is kind of a necessity is that the device itself is kind of slippery in the hands. And with this case, just because it's got kind of a matte plastic finish, it prevents this thing from slipping. In fact, this thing's so slippery, it literally fell off of this desk. And I have a video on my Discord server, if you're curious, of this thing just gradually sliding down. I guess I need to level up my desk, but anyway, I've never had an MP3 player slide off it before. Yeah, so I guess let's get into talking about then I guess the rest of the materials and handling on this device, because it is a very, very well built device. Despite the fact it being, you know, an entry-level digital audio player, everything about this is, you know, appropriately premium in feel. So you've got an aluminum edge all the way around, which is nice. And then you've got glass on both the back and the front. And I talk about this pretty much every time I talk about a device that has a glass back is I don't really need, I mean, I get that it feels nice and I get that it's good for the Bluetooth radios and stuff like that, but I'm okay with a plastic back because, man, the glass, it just makes it a little bit too slippery in the hand, but of course it does also feel quite nice. Let's see, what else can we talk about while we're talking about the physical stuff? I mean, I guess we'll talk briefly about the screen. It's a pretty decent quality screen. As you can see, the viewing angles on it are pretty good. They do dim a little bit, but I don't know, nothing really to complain about. If you're used to a smartphone screen with an OLED and like the black levels are not going to be super awesome, the pixel density is not going to be super fantastic, but honestly, I really don't have any complaints about it. It's, you know, big enough that, let me pull in my iPhone mini for a comparison so you can just kind of get a sense for the size of this player. This thing's still pretty compact, but it's big enough that browsing music files and stuff like that, there's plenty of room. It doesn't feel overly cramped and it doesn't feel like you're using a software that is really super hobbled just to make do with the screen size. Okay, overall, just honestly, I really do love the form factor of this device a lot. I really do. It's just a great size. It's compact and large enough to handle well. Like, doesn't really make any compromises in terms of handling, apart from it just being a little bit too slippery. Let's quickly talk about the buttons, which I'm a big fan of. In fact, if you don't get the idea of why having an MP3 player in 2023 now makes sense, for me, it's all about the buttons. I love having buttons on my audio players, and well, the buttons here are quite good. It's everything you need and nothing you don't. So you got your power on button that turns the screen on and off, and then you've got your play pause in the middle with previous track on the top and next track on the bottom. Over here on the other side, you've got your simple volume up and down, and that's it. So a quick note on that is just a lot of compact audio players will make sacrifices on the buttons. Like I remember Fiio used to double duty. They would just have volume buttons without the track skip buttons. But then if you press and held the volume buttons, you would skip tracks, and I hated that because it would just meant that I was skipping tracks when I didn't want to. And I really appreciate that the R3 Pro Saber doesn't have any of those sacrifices. As far as the I/O on this device, I mentioned earlier that there is a micro SD card slot here on the bottom, as well you've got USB-C down on the bottom for charging. What that means is that your headphone jacks are on the top, and you've got a 3.5 millimeter output for single-ended, and as well you've got a balance connector, which is still a 2.5 millimeter. You know, I would have liked to have seen Hiby, given that they were bothering to update this thing for 2022, I would have liked to have seen them switch over to a 4.4 millimeter. Not that it even really matters that much to me. I'm not a big balance guy, but if I'm gonna pick balanced, I do like the 4.4. It just feels nicer. 2.5, it's just smaller. I don't know. I guess while we're talking about the headphone jacks being on the top, I will say that is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I definitely prefer to have my audio jacks on the bottom of my player, although because this one's so small, it didn't bother me as much as it does on some of the larger Android players that have audio jacks on the top. Just because basically putting the audio jacks on the top, for me, effectively shortens the cable, right? Because now the distance between my head and the audio jacks is an extra 3 inches further. And if it was a taller Android player, it'd be like even further. So it's not quite as big a deal here, but I did actually do a survey of the Super Review audience and got like over 1,000 votes. And by far, like by a factor of 2 to 1, people prefer to have the audio jacks on the bottom. So I'm not alone, but I don't know. It's a small complaint. I guess the last thing that I'll mention while we're talking about the I/O in this thing is that I was a little bit, I don't know, maybe just surprised to see that things like these little audio jacks are not actually centered. Can you see that? And it's even true down here on the bottom. These things are not quite centered. And I have a feeling that just has to do with the fact that they're working with a pretty small footprint and pretty limited, but you know, a small quibble. Maybe more importantly, and this is also a pretty small quibble, but I don't know if you can tell, the 3.5 and the 2.5 visually look identical. What you have to do is you have to squint to see that there is a plastic black ring inside of the 2.5 millimeter connector, which makes that one smaller. Otherwise, they basically look the same. And just, you know, for the first couple of days when I was using this device, I kept forgetting where to put it in. you figure that stuff out pretty quick though. But yeah, overall, really pretty happy with the physical stuff on this device. So let's get into talking about the functionality, and there's going to be a lot to cover here. I always warn that my DAP reviews end up being a little bit on the long side, but we'll get into it. And I will also warn that UX experience, design, stuff like that is, I'm pretty picky about it. So I might complain about some things here that don't matter at all to you. And if they don't matter to you, please feel free to disregard my complaints, but I am nonetheless going to bring them up. I'll give you, just start off with a quick overview of kind of like the operating system on this. This is using Hiby's own operating system. I believe it's open source because a lot of other Android or non-Android players use it. Or at least they used to when they were still making these things. But yeah, it's an operating system that's been around for a while, and it's not bad. It's not my favorite operating system. I definitely do prefer Android. But as far as these non-Android players go, yeah, it's pretty decent. So let's see, where do we start with? Well, if you scroll over here to the far left, you get access to a bunch of menu options. You've got an ebook option. I don't know. That's not something I tested, I'll promise you. Pedometer, also did not test it. Unfortunately, if you were looking for feedback on that, I have no information. But you can get to, of course, things like playback settings, where you can adjust the way that it plays through your albums, gapless, whether gapless is on or not. I don't know who would ever turn that off. Someone's turning off gapless, but not for me. But maybe more interesting would be down here with the system settings. And I don't know, I'll dig into a couple of these system settings in a little bit, but for now, let's just go back to kind of like the overview of the device. So if you're here now, when you're on the main player, you've now got this menu bar up top that navigates to a couple of key areas. Like the main area really is just your music browser, which again, I'll dig into a little bit more in a bit. Here you've got a list of favorites, I suppose. As you can see, I didn't use this in playlists and stuff like that. I'm not a big playlist guy, so didn't really use that. You've also got this option for title. And as I tap it, like just kind of watch briefly, like there's this message that shows up that gets cut off. You can't even read the whole message. Oh no, now it's asking me for, oh, interesting. Well, never mind. It was showing me a different menu before. I'm not sure if I updated this thing. But anyway, you do also have the option to search. And then, of course, you can go to sort of a full screen version of your album art or whatever it is that you're currently playing. So, I mean, that's just kind of like the general overview. It's pretty straightforward in terms of navigating music. It has a lot in common. If you're familiar with Hiby's other players, it's got a lot in common with those, including some of the things I don't love. Some pretty small things, but I don't know. Let's talk first about the scroll performance. And I'll just give you kind of an example, right? Scrolling is generally pretty good. It's got momentum, like it feels pretty good. But one thing that's probably standing out is that the box arts are pretty slow to load. And like their Android version, if I never lift my finger from the screen, it seems like it never loads the art. So I have to lift my finger and then it will decide to load them. And then even then, it's fairly slow. So if you are a person that likes to navigate your music by visually, just by like looking at what the album is, I don't know, Hiby's software generally is just not very good with that, but it is otherwise relatively smooth scrolling. Another thing that I will complain about is that, oh no, I just turned up the brightness. Hold on. Don't want that to overexpose here on the camera. One of the other things I want to complain about, and again, this is a thing that Hiby does generally, even on their Android software, is that all albums or all artists that start with the word "the" get alphabetized under T. And I guess it's a bit of a judgment call. Do you want the Cranberries to show up under C or T? I prefer them to show up under C. Not a big fan of all my stuff ending up under T, but it is, again, a small complaint. Maybe you don't care about it, but it is one of those things that I do definitely prefer it when they don't do this. Let's see, what else could I talk about? Okay, you do have this little menu. I kind of did this by accident, but you've got this little menu with access to a couple of quick shortcuts. Like you can easily toggle it from low gain into high gain. It's not doing it now because I don't have a headphone attached. You can turn on and off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. I think that's turning on and off the system-wide EQ, but to be honest, I did not use all of those functions very much. The last thing that I'll talk about as we're talking about just general system-wide stuff is that there is, of course, this option to update the database, which every time you put new music on this device, you're going to want to hit that button. It's going to scan your music card and add that music into the library. I just bring that up now because it's kind of slow on this device. I have about 4,000 songs on my player card, and it took about 7 minutes to do it. So it's not a thing that you're going to do all the time. It's only whenever you load new music on it, but it is nonetheless, it's something that the Android players are definitely doing better these days. Let's see, any other quibbles I wanted to get out of the way? One thing, I guess, maybe a small quibble, is that they've got like these navigation menu buttons up here that I mentioned. I do wish that they were always available, because there's some screens like this where you can see they take those buttons away, and then that means that sometimes you just end up scrolling a lot. All right, let's take maybe a better example, right? Let's navigate into the Smashing Pumpkins, Melancholy and Infinite Sadness, right? If I want to get back to that top level menu, I just have to back out, and then finally get to here. It's a few swipes away. I feel like if that menu was always available, it would just make this feel a lot more accessible and simple. But again, small complaints that I like to bring up. Anything else I wanted to talk about? I guess the last thing that I'll mention, and I'm not going to be able to demonstrate this on demand, but there have been a couple of times where the software effectively locked up on me, but it wasn't a hard lock. It was a lock that would eventually recover, but it would just hang for 30 seconds, sometimes a minute at a time. And it's a thing that over the past few weeks I've been living with this thing, it's happened 3 or 4 times, just to put it in context. It's not a thing you're going to be living with all the time, but depending on like how sloppy you are with the controls, there you go. I might have kind of triggered it there. That was a short version of it. Sometimes it takes longer than that to recover, and it's a little annoying. Again, it's a budget player. It's not as good as the Android stuff, and those are some of the trade-offs, unfortunately, that you do have to make. All right, anything else to talk about here? I mean, we'll dip back into the player software. I mean, I already kind of covered it. Like, the organization makes sense. You can switch between artists, album, and files. I'm an album listener, so I always start with artists. I always navigate into an artist. I find the album I want to listen to, and I listen to it like that. But let's see, there are a couple of things. Okay, I already mentioned that the Cure ends up under T. That's a small thing. I think a big thing though is, well, let's use the Cure as an example. Oh, no, they're not under C. Let's instead use something that is under C. Let's use Churches as an example. So you see, I've got multiple albums by the Churches. The Churches, my goodness. Okay, what's going on here? It's just Churches. I've got multiple albums by them, and if I wanted to just listen to all of these albums one after the other and then have them loop it, unfortunately, there's not really an option to do that, because I have to go in here and I can play this album, and then I can navigate over here and play that album manually. But a lot of times, like, I just want to put it on in the background and have a Churches afternoon. And to do that, well, you can tap this button up here, which will switch it into just a song mode. But as you can see, it's now organized the songs alphabetically rather than by album. And again, maybe that's a small thing that only I care about, but as an album listener, I want to listen to the Churches album back to back, and have it loop for an afternoon. And unfortunately, with this setup, I can't really do that. I can listen to the Churches for an afternoon, but they're just not going to be in the order that I tend to associate those songs. All right, let's see. Anything else I wanted to talk about? I guess I'll talk briefly about, I mentioned that there is compatibility with Tidal. There's also, I think, compatibility with Qobuz. Those are not streaming platforms I use, so I don't have experience with using them. The one thing I will mention is that I dug into the thread on HeadFi that was dedicated to this device, and it sounds like there might be some software issues that people are having. Some issues with like logging into it and getting logged out every day or something like that. I didn't experience it myself. Again, not really a use case I have. If I'm going to stream, I'm just going to use my phone. And in fact, there's some pretty good functionality in here that lets you use your phone as the host device and connect to this thing over Bluetooth, and then just, play Spotify or Tidal on your phone instead, which I think is pretty cool, but I don't know, worth bringing up. Okay, so that's just the general player functionality, a quick dive into equalizer functionality, and there's a couple of different options. So they've got the equalizer in general, and then they've got this thing called MSEB. It's like something 8-ball, magic something 8-ball. I don't know. It's a weird name for an EQ. I'll dive into the equalizer first, just to give you an idea. It's a typical 10-band EQ. right? I don't know. It's got some presets, but of course you can customize it however you want. I'm not a big EQ guy, but it is nice that there is an option there. I will also point out that there were some oddities here where the first time I was playing around with it, it was not taking effect. And yes, I was double checking that this power switch is on. The EQ was not taking effect until just like kind of randomly I connected it to Bluetooth and then disconnected it to Bluetooth, and then the EQ started working, which I don't know, it's weird. I'll also say that the EQ here will let you completely push the frequency response to the point that it causes distortions and stuff like that. So just be careful. My general advice when doing EQ is don't do this, don't do big boosts. Generally, you're better off by doing this, cutting, and you'll avoid any issues with clipping. And then I mentioned quickly the MSEB, the weird 8-ball EQ. This is actually pretty cool because it sort of is like an abstraction of EQ. Rather than manipulating the specific frequencies, it gives you these audiophile words like bass extension, temperature, warmth and darkness, bass texture, note thickness. And it gives you sliders on adjusting that stuff up or down. I don't know exactly what these things are doing. I assume they're just versions of equalizers, but it's kind of cool to have this. One, you know, if you're getting just kind of introduced to the audiophile world, that's the word, and people are using these words that are a little confusing, you can kind of get a sense with this tool, like, okay, what do people mean by a warm sound versus a dark sound? What do people mean by crisp or thick? That's pretty cool. And also just if, you know, you don't know what, you know, go back to our normal equalizer, if you don't know what 125 hertz sounds like, well, you can just play around with those MSEB equalizers and have that. Again, I'm not a big EQ guy, so I personally didn't use it much. I will point out that those EQ functions in my testing did not carry over to Bluetooth. So if you're looking for a way to equalize your iPhone, unfortunately, this will not do that. But yeah, quickly on the topic of the Bluetooth functionality, again, I mentioned it a little bit up front, but basically you can, well, let's see if we can go into this quickly. I'm definitely not going to try and connect, but wireless settings, you can turn on Bluetooth, and this might even try connecting to my laptop in a different room. There you go. It'll go into this Bluetooth mode, and well, one thing that's cool is I like that it shows you the Bluetooth codec that it's using, so nice confirmation that currently it's on SBC. As soon as I start playing music from my iMac or my MacBook, it'll start switching over to AAC, which is what you would want to see, and it's nice to be able to see that. But yeah, it just kind of turns this into kind of a version of a Qlix 5K or a Fiio, what do they even call it? Oh my gosh, a Fiio Q5, or no, it's not. Oh my gosh. I'm tripping here. BTR5, Jesus. Okay. It'll kind of turn it into one of those little things. So you could connect this to your phone, play music on Spotify, have it come out the headphone jack of this thing, and that's pretty cool. The pairing was very simple, nice and straightforward. Again, I like that it shows the codec that is in use. A couple of small quibbles. One, the volume on this is not synchronized with my phone or my MacBook, so that means that if I want this thing to get as loud as possible, I have to turn up the volume as loud as possible on my phone and turn up the volume as loud as possible on the Hiby. You know, it's a small quibble, but that is a thing to note. And then also, there was a little bit of Bluetooth latency when I was watching just some YouTube videos. It was noticeable, very noticeable, but I think it's also very usable and pretty small complaints for me in the long run, to be honest. The last thing that I will mention is that it does also support Wi-Fi. You can see here, let me punch on that so you can see. It does support Wi-Fi connectivity. And as far as I can tell, there are basically two main functionalities from that. One, you can import music via Wi-Fi, and that's not a functionality I tried, so unfortunately I can't tell you how that worked. But what I did like is that you can actually do over-the-air updates, which means that there's firmware updates for this thing. You can connect it to Wi-Fi and just do it over the internet rather than having to pull out a memory card and plug it back in. Okay, well, that is a lot of the software experience functionality. Real quick, we'll talk about the battery life on this device. Hiby claims about 20 hours of battery life on single-ended connector. Again, that's the 3.5 mil, and about 15 hours on balanced, which that roughly I mean, I didn't measure it exactly, but I use this thing quite a bit. I would sleep with it overnight because I listen to music when I sleep, wake up, and it would go from like 100% down to like 60%, right? So yeah, that tracks. I'm getting about 20, a little over 20 hours, honestly, playback. The other thing is that they claim that this thing has 50 hours of standby time, and frankly, that's kind of important for me, is how, if I put a device down and I come back to it a few later, does it still have battery life? Things that don't, that die after a few days, it makes me not want to use them. In fact, that's why I sold my AirPods Max. But the standby life on this thing is actually pretty good. Again, they claim 50 hours, but I will say that it depends on your settings. So I mentioned when we go back into these system settings briefly, just so I can kind of complain about something else, because I like to complain. So there's a number of options in here that affect your battery life, right? You got the backlight time. How long does it take for the screen to turn itself off? Normally I have it at a minute. I turned it to stays on for the review so it doesn't turn itself off, whatever. That's pretty normal. There is also down here an idle timer, a sleep timer, and then a standby mode. And the difference between idle timer and sleep timer, I think, to be honest, I forget. But basically what was happening initially when I first got this thing is that the way that it would preserve battery life is by just turning itself off. It would just power itself off when I wasn't using it for like 5 or 10 minutes. And yeah, that'll save you a lot of battery life. But that means then that every time I pick it up to play it, I gotta wait for the thing to boot up. And it's not super slow to boot up, but it's more time than I wanna wait. So I wasn't super happy with that. But then I did fine. So basically I turned off both the idle timer and the sleep timer. And I turned on this switch standby, which for some reason is not turned on by default, but this ended up being the setting that I like the best. So basically what this means is that if I stop using this device for, even like 10 or 15 seconds, it'll go into the standby mode where, well, obviously if no music is playing, it'll go into the standby mode, and there it's saving battery. And if I hit the power button, it very quickly turns on and I can go back to doing what I was doing. And the standby life was very good in standby mode. So no problems there. If I didn't have standby mode and I just turned these things off, the battery would die within like 24 hours without anything playing on it. So the standby mode really does help a lot. A couple of small quibbles that are worth pointing out about the standby mode though. If this thing goes into standby mode, right, the screen's powered off, I haven't touched it for a few minutes, and it goes into standby mode, the play button will not work, or just none of these buttons will work. I'll have to turn the screen on, and it happens quickly again, so it's not a big problem, but I will have to turn the screen on before I begin playing my music. Again, a small quibble, but something worth pointing out. One thing that was kind of interesting and frankly pretty surprising is that I plugged this into, I wanted to just charge this, so I plugged it into USB while it was in standby mode, and it seemed like it didn't start charging. Like I had left it on the charger for a couple of hours, came back to check it, and it had never started charging. So I actually had to turn it on and then plug it in while it was not in standby mode in order for it to begin charging. Small little software stuff. Honestly, that's the kind of stuff I'd love to see them fix if they can with firmware updates, but given that they have been updating this firmware for, 5+ years now, I don't know that those sorts of things are things that will get fixed. Okay, anything else to say? I mean, yeah, just overall in terms of the battery life, like, I got a couple of small quibbles, I guess, but generally pretty happy with it, right? 20 hours of battery life is more than enough for me. I'm gonna go 2, probably 3 days in between charges. And yeah, that's about what I want out of an audio player. That's one of the sacrifices with most Android players is that you don't get 3 days of battery life out of here. 20 hours, it's good enough. It's not top of the line, but it's definitely good enough. Okay, let's now talk about the sound here on the Hiby R3 Pro Saber 2022. And like I mentioned up front, I'm not the guy that's going to tell you all about the sound stage and depth and stuff like that comes from a player like this, because my general, I'll just give this disclaimer every time until people stop asking me about it. My general opinion is that all DAPs basically sound the same. They don't sound exactly the same, but they basically sound the same, to the point that, like, if I listen to one day and another the other day, I would not be able to tell you the difference. In fact, if there's like 30 seconds in between me listening to one versus the other, I really cannot reliably tell you the difference. And I don't really think that, I don't know, maybe other people can, but my general thought is that this just sounds like a clean, neutral, normal sounding DAC. It is using an updated version of the ESS DAC. It's the 9219, if you care. And then also on their literature, I don't know if it's going to be here. Is it here? Maybe it's just on their website. It's basically, so it's using a dual DAC setup because it does have a balanced output, and that's pretty typical. But apparently each DAC is itself a quad DAC. So in combination, this thing they're claiming has 8 DACs. Does that matter? I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure it matters to somebody. I'm sure it matters to some sort of measurements or something like that. To me, to listen to it, it just sounds nice and clean. There are some things that I do hear, sound differences that we'll go through bullet point by bullet point that I'd listen for and adapt. But in terms of just overall general sound signature, this just sounds pretty normal. Okay, so some things in terms of differences between DACs that are very audible noise differences will be things like power output, right? How loud can it get? Can it power your headphones? That's a night and day difference, right? If you plug in a headphone into a DAC and it can't get it loud enough, well, that's an obvious on paper difference. The power ratings on this thing on single-ended is 100 milliwatts of power at 32 ohms, and on balance, it's 340 milliwatts. I will say 100 milliwatts on single-ended is not super high. 340 on balance is actually really good. But even still at 100 milliwatts, using my hardest to drive headphone that I've got on hand, which I think is currently my Orbis Everest, even on single-ended connection on low gain, I was able to get this thing more than loud enough for the way that I listen. Again, your individual listening preferences might be different. If you're using a lot of that EQ and you're cutting frequencies, maybe your needs are different than mine. But for me, on single-ended on low gain, this thing gets more than loud enough for all of my headphones. If you need more power, well, they've got high gain. And then of course you can switch into balance mode, which gives you 340 milliwatts of power. So as far as I'm concerned, more than enough power on this device for everything that I've got. Yes, everything, every headphone, every IEM. When it comes to IEMs, actually, the next thing that I like to look for is the noise floor, right? Usually, this is a very general statement, but as you increase the maximum potential power output of a device, a lot of the times that incurs just an increase in the noise floor, or a hiss. Maybe is another word to use for that, right? If you've ever plugged in a sensitive earphone into a computer that maybe doesn't have a great DAC, you can start hearing just this audible background hiss. And it can range from like slightly audible to, but ignorable to really just kind of intrusive. And I will say that the noise floor on the R3 is actually really, really good. And it's actually surprisingly good performance. In fact, even on balance connector, I was using my test for this is that I've got the Campfire Audio Aura, a very, very sensitive IM. I've got a balance connector. I throw that on this, and that's going to be the best chance for this thing to generate hiss. And it is audible, but even on balance connector with the most sensitive IM I have, it to me is not a problem. It's actually a really, really well-controlled noise floor on this device. And then the last thing that I will listen for when it comes to sound differences between players will be things like interferences, right? And this will often come up on some other players. Let's say if you're doing something that's really intensive with the CPU, right? Especially with Android players, and let's say you're playing a game while listening to music. Sometimes the high demands of the processor can cause interferences that you can actually audibly hear through the audio chain. Obviously, you're not going to be playing any games here on the R3 Pro, and I've never had issues with that. And then the other thing would be, like radio interferences, either from the Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth. Similar thing, right? If you are stressing the Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth on a device and listening to music at the same time, sometimes you can hear audible interferences and little artifacts come through. Thankfully, here on the R3, zero issues. Okay, so generally it gets plenty loud enough for me. The noise floor is surprisingly well controlled for a device, especially at this price range, and I had no issues with interferences. So for me, as far as I'm concerned, this is an excellent sounding digital audio player, and that's about as much as I can tell you about that. So that's probably going to do it for my thoughts here on the Hiby R3 Pro Saber 2022 edition. Overall, I like this little device. Now, I'm kind of spoiled by Android devices at this point, and I understand not everybody wants to either spend you know, $400 or $500 on an audio player, or, you know, maybe they still just like these simple bare bones devices. And I like this one. I like it. You know, it's got some sacrifices in terms of the UX of it, but the utility of it, being able to use it as a USB DAC or a Bluetooth transmitter thing, I dig that stuff. And I really like the form factor of it. So overall, like, you know, I got some quibbles with it, but I'm still going to give the R3 Pro Saber 2022 a solid 4 stars out of 4. And if you're interested in checking this thing out, well, I got links in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this review helpful, you're having a happy Sunday afternoon, as it is Sunday, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and share this video with someone who you think might be interested. Otherwise, I'll catch you on the next super review, unless you're here live, in which case hang out and let's have a chat.